We tend to think of prisons as fitting punishments for criminals. They live in tiny cells, eat bland food, and of course, they don't have their freedom. But what if I told you some criminals are so powerful, they could get a prison to their own special liking? This was the case with Pablo Escobar in the early 1990s. After being chased by the DEA for years, Pablo finally accepted a deal. He would go to prison, but he would build his own. In hindsight, maybe that wasn't a great deal. Pablo had chef-made food, jacuzzis, and a soccer pitch. He even had the freedom to continue conducting his illegal business via phones and frequent visitors. How did Pablo manage to get this luxurious punishment? And why did it all come to a brutal end? We'll explore these questions and many more in today's video. To get to Pablo Escobar's luxury prison, we need to understand how he got the power to build his own prison in the first place. Pablo was born in Medellin, Colombia on December 1st, 1949, the son of a school teacher mom and a farmer dad. You might think, hey, that's a nice family to grow up with, but Pablo hated the poverty, and he would do anything, literally anything, to get rich. He started with fake high school diplomas and lottery tickets. Still a teenager, he moved to stealing tombstones and cars, and by his early 20s, he was into commercial robbery and kidnappings. He'd learned to use violence and intimidation for cash. As early as 1971, Pablo also killed a man. He and his gang kidnapped businessman Diego Echevarria for $50,000 ransom from the Echevarria family. But when they got the ransom, they killed him anyway. Pablo was only 21. He would be arrested a couple of times before he even entered the business and started his notorious empire, the Medellin cartel. Colombia was becoming the capital of the coke world while Pablo was considering new criminal endeavors, so he just seized the opportunity. In the mid-1970s, he founded the Medellin cartel together with the Ochoa brothers. Their goal was to handle everything, production, smuggling, and selling in Colombia and the US.
They started to bring in cocaine from Peru, from Bolivia, and converting it into cocaine hydrochloride. And then from there, they had access to the Caribbean Ocean, and they were able to use some of the Caribbean islands as transshipment points into the United States, principally southern Florida.
Talk about the US. Around the same time Pablo was rising to drug kingpin, US President Richard Nixon declared war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
War meant the arrest of anyone involved in the drug trade was a top priority for the authorities. But huge cartels like the Medellin weren't going to be intimidated by this. In fact, white powder consumption only grew in the US between 1970 and 1990, and it was all thanks to Pablo Escobar. At his peak, Escobar was making north of $50 million each day in cash. The more money he made, the more Mexican and American authorities worked to arrest him. But this was only a double-edged sword. Pablo only got more paranoid and desperate to avoid prison, so he would bribe politicians, judges, and officers to keep doing illegal work. His smuggle routes were protected and his crimes were covered up by corrupt officials. In the late 1980s, Pablo even entered politics himself. Of course, this was a dangerous move, as his crimes would only be more easily exposed, but Pablo was a popular figure in Colombia. He was seen as a sort of a Robin Hood, stealing from the rich Wall Street fiends to give to the poor communities of Colombia. He built restaurants, discos, soccer pitches, and even housing for the poor. But of course, he wasn't a philanthropist at heart. Pablo was just establishing more political power so that he could control every move inside the Colombian government and avoid going to jail. In 1989, Pablo brought down a civilian plane, believing an enemy politician was on board. 110 people were killed, bar the politician, who had canceled at the last minute. In 1990, Luis Carlos Galán was running for president. His discourse was simple. If he was elected president, he would clean the country of drug lords and extradite them to the US to give the power back to the legal eagles. Pablo didn't like that one bit. More than anything, he feared being extradited to the US. There, he couldn't control anything. So, he assassinated Galán.
The second element of our strategy looks beyond our borders, where the cocaine and crack bought on America's streets is grown and processed. In Colombia alone, cocaine killers have gunned down a leading statesman, murdered almost 200 judges and 7 members of their Supreme Court.
A year later, Pablo orchestrated a new constitution for Colombia, which prevented any Colombian national from being extradited to the US. This was just one of the 2 crazy things he would do in 1991, because the same year, Pablo Escobar turned himself in. On June 19, 1991, Pablo Escobar sat down with the top dogs of the Colombian government and offered them a deal. He would go to prison for 5 years on Colombian soil. Of course, there was a big catch. Pablo would get to build his own prison. He wouldn't have a tiny cell, but a whole palace filled with his own men, female escorts, and entertainment. Pablo had been on the run from authorities for years. He knew that one way or another, he would soon get caught, especially as his crimes were getting worse every year. At the same time, he was also looking over his shoulder because of vigilante groups known as the Los Pepes. They were people once wronged by Escobar, who came together to kill him, and the Medellin cartel members. They would go on to assassinate hundreds of his associates, friends, and family, and virtually reduce the Medellin cartel to ashes in the year that Pablo died. On top of that, the Medellin cartel was in the middle of a bloody war with the Cali cartel. Pablo's daughter, Manuela, was a mere toddler when she was injured in a bombing meant to kill him. Pablo was truly scared for his life, so he devised a perfect hideout that shockingly satisfied Colombian authorities too, a palace he called prison, called La Catedral. La Catedral resembled a luxurious resort more than an actual prison. It had a bar, disco, jacuzzi, pool, sauna, gym, and a waterfall. It didn't have a restaurant per se, but Pablo ate chef-made food every single day. There was also a soccer pitch, which Pablo spent most of his time in TVs to watch his favorite soccer teams play. Pablo Escobar even had professional soccer players visit him in prison. Once, the entire national football team visited him, using off-road vehicles to get to the top of the mountain. Escobar had his chef serve them a multiple-course meal. Then, they played a soccer game. But of course, the opposing team had to let Escobar win. He got really angry when he didn't, and when Pablo was angry, you could get killed. After the game, the national team stayed late in the evening to party at the prison's disco. Indeed, throughout his time at La Catedral, Pablo threw several parties, some with VIP attendants, escorts, and of course, white powder. If you're asking how the latter made it inside, well, they were hidden in military vehicles, brought in and taken back to Medellin by corrupt officers. Needless to say, La Catedral also had luxurious rooms for his guests. He couldn't just send his party guest home at 4 in the morning, could he? And when he celebrated his 42nd birthday from prison, Pablo had special chefs come in and cook for him, brought from Medellin's top restaurants. That day, Pablo and his visiting family enjoyed turkey, smoked salmon, smoked trout, and caviar, among other delicacies. Talk about his family. On La Catedral's grounds, Pablo had a life-size dollhouse built just for the days his daughter would come visit. La Catedral was built on the top of a hill surrounded by forests. This meant that the prison was virtually impenetrable. He was safe from his enemies. Escobar's men could see anyone approaching from miles away. No one could make it in without being shot. And the prison was so high up that it was usually surrounded by fog. This also made airstrikes very difficult.
Escobar's men heavily guarded the prison to ensure his safety. The fortress kept his enemies out and his friends in. In other words, it was the perfect place for Pablo to continue running his empire from behind bars.
Yep. Not only did Pablo have every luxury he could think of inside his prison, he was perfectly able to carry on conducting his business. He was still the Medellin kingpin, the king of coke, and the most powerful man in Colombia, even inside his prison. As word of La Catedral spread, people realized the deal with the government was another force made possible by corrupt politicians. La Catedral became known as Hotel Escobar, an ironic but sad name, considering that many hotels didn't have the luxurious amenities that Escobar's prison did. And to make matters worse, the authorities also realized that prison was keeping Pablo safe from his enemies above all else. In other words, they realized La Catedral worked in Escobar's favor, not theirs. There was another problem. Pablo Escobar was a violent man, and as he realized he could do anything he pleased inside the prison walls, his violence skyrocketed. Once he tortured and killed 4 of his lieutenants over a money dispute, and in 1992, he ordered the assassination of 2 cartel members on the prison's phone. These were enough to make the government rethink La Catedral's and Pablo's fake sentence. The plan was to surprise Escobar and move him to a high-security federal prison in Colombia. But Escobar was still very powerful. He had people infiltrated everywhere, including the national police, so he knew they were coming. In July 1992, two officials came to tell Escobar that he was being moved to a more secure location under the government's control. Pablo responded by capturing them and keeping them hostage. But as he was deciding what to do with them, a gunfight ensued, and Pablo used this to his advantage. On July 22nd, a mere 13 months from his conviction, Pablo Escobar escaped from prison. However, this was the beginning of the end for the Lord. It would have been easier for Escobar to comply with the authorities and go to a normal prison. Pablo Escobar lived for 16 more months after his escape in constant fear of Colombian police, the DEA, the government, Los Pepes, and rival cartels. His family wasn't safe anymore. His men were being gunned down like flies by the violent Los Pepes, and the DEA was putting more and more energy into his capture.
Los Pepes were tremendously effective, and I think they were key in isolating Escobar fairly rapidly. They pretty much stripped him of much of his organization.
Well, it was to our advantage. You got to give Los Pepes a lot of credit for Pablo Escobar's demise, because they are the ones that waged the dirty war. The Los Pepes are really responsible for the fact that Pablo Escobar at the end was pretty much alone. I mean, he didn't have many people anymore.
And no amount of money could help Escobar's men infiltrate the DEA. It was actually the other way around this time. The DEA had infiltrated the Medellin cartel, using the intelligence to seize his estate, exotic animals, cash, and of course,
He seized vast amounts of money. And the other thing we're doing, we're trying to seize as much of his dope, as much of his cocaine as possible.
As Escobar was getting more and more paranoid, he became even more violent. On January 30th, 1993, he attempted to assassinate the head of the Colombian security office with a car bomb. The target wasn't hit, but 21 civilians were killed and dozens were maimed.
His car was going by, and his car was a bulletproof vehicle. It blew the car to one side. There were half bodies of children and people all over the street that were waiting for the school bus. And when you see that, and you still think the guy's a rabbit, it's hard for me to understand that.
His arrest was imminent. The DEA was listening to his calls and using the signals to track him down. In October 1993, Pablo's wife Maria and their two children nearly escaped an assassination attempt by Los Pepes. Scared for their lives, they flew to Germany to seek asylum. That's when the DEA contacted the German authorities and had the family sent back to Colombia. This angered and scared Pablo so much that he started making phone calls left and right, begging or threatening authorities to let his family fly away.
The minute he heard that Germany had denied the request, he was on the phone making threats, calling the German embassy, saying he would kill people, saying he would blow things up. There was no telling what would happen. The walls were caving in around Pablo Escobar. He was taking more risks. He was making more phone calls. He was also becoming more threatening in his tones. His acts of desperation made us feel that we were getting closer and closer and closer.
One of his biggest risks was a phone call he made to his son on the day after his 44th birthday. DEA and the Colombian search block were listening. Within an hour, Escobar was tracked to his aunt's house in Medellin, but this time, Pablo knew he wouldn't go to La Catedral if he was arrested, so he ran up the stairs, all the way to the rooftop, shooting at the officers. He probably knew this was the end. He would die a free man, confirming his old motto, better dead in Colombia than alive in a U.S. prison. Pablo Escobar died on December 2nd, 1993 in Medellin, Colombia. The only time he served in prison for his Lord crimes was just over a year in a prison of his own making. Pablo enjoyed all of life's luxuries and then some. Luxuries many of us never experience in a lifetime. And yet Pablo was living this life while serving a sentence. It's hard to believe how many people he bought, from street officers to judges and government officials. Today, La Catedral serves as an asylum for the poor and elderly, run by the Benedictine monks. But it will always be a reminder of the dangers of kingpins' powers Power can truly blind a person, and once they have enough money to bribe authorities, nothing can stop them. Well, almost nothing.